Boucher is a writer and folklorist who focuses on her native Shropshire. Her emphasis is primarily on the interplay between folklore, history, and the paranormal, and perceptions of the past through the lens of folk beliefs. But her talks are fascinating, and I'm sure you'll love it. So, ladies and gentlemen, Amy Boucher.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So tonight I'm going to be talking about the devil, which is one of my favourite subjects. I'm always harking on about him. But in particular, the devil in Shropshire, because as we all know, the devil is a frequent character throughout the whole length and breadth of the British Isles in folklore, but he seems to have a particular proclivity for Shropshire, and he is a frequent feature of Shropshire folklore. He seems to attach himself to everything from agrarian landscapes to more industrialised ones, such as Jackfield and Ironbridge, which I'm going to be talking about shortly. But before we go into details with some of the stories, I'd like to just point out some things that are worth knowing about the devil in the Shropshire folklore context, but also things that maybe are portrayed that might not necessarily be true. So the one of which is the link between the devil and the medieval period. Certainly, there was an idea of Satan in the medieval period, and he was a frequent feature in religion and daily life. But the folkloric devil is slightly different, and many of our stories are actually from within the last 300 to 350 years. Certainly some of them can be linked to the religious insecurities and the religious diversions of the English Civil War, but they're not medieval in origin, because the medieval devil is a very, very, very different entity to the feckless folkloric devil who at times can be undone by common folk. And in the same vein, it's also a bit of a fallacy to link every story of the devil, at least in the Shropshire context, to this continuation of pagan origins. Again, there is the influence of paganism and Christianity within that vein, but if anything, he is a symbol of humanity, and he's a lot more of a human character, but he certainly isn't a continuation of this long-lasting pagan influence. You do see in Shropshire, which we'll mention shortly, him linked to some sites that have had a pagan history throughout, but he isn't a remnants of paganism. He is very, very human in his portrayal in Shropshire, and certainly I would argue that he is a character that is made of multitudes. I think that the devil walks unfettered amongst Shropshire folk, and he subtly interacts with his environment and influences all those he comes into contact with. I would argue that he is the great equalizer, as he interacts with the highest echelons of society, all the way through to farm labourers and working class blokes in the pub. And as we shall soon see, that no one is truly safe from his guile and his power. The Abrahamic devil is something that certainly has influenced our concept of the folkloric devil, but he should be seen as having bled into folk narratives and creating a concept that is thus not quite religious. I think that the folkloric devil is a very highly symbolic and distinct entity and fills a number of different factors. He is a trickster, he is a tempter, he's feckless, and yet can be very astute. He is seen in some of our Shropshire folk tales as the arbiter of justice, a moraliser, yet absolutely wicked in his schemes. He can be absolutely absurd and yet also very familiar and quite human in his portrayal. In some stories, as we'll see, he's a character worthy of fear, And yet in others, he can be a subject of pity and even ridicule. I think in truth, his characteristics are quite complex, but so are we. And I think that those intricacies within the storytelling tradition, they make the stories even more enthralling. I believe that the devil as a symbol in folklore is powerful, not necessarily because of traditional ideas of good and evil, but because he is a conduit for the anxieties and fears of whoever speaks his name. The devil's importance lies in the fact that men and women have believed in him and they've acted upon that belief, weaving these narratives across the centuries to emphasize their belief. And thus, we should really be seeing the devil as, certainly in the folkloric context, as a gateway to humanity. And by looking at these stories, we can actually gain a greater understanding of those who came before us. I believe that the devil is fluid. He shifts and changes with every intonation, and he gains further purpose with each new retelling of his tale. So really what I'm trying to say is that the folkloric devil is human in origin. He's a monster of our imaginings, and we serve as his creator. Compared to many of the stock characters that are scattered across British folklore, his perceived humanity makes him more familiar. You can witness him interacting with people in the pub and suffering from the same follies and struggles as us. It's been suggested that perhaps the devil has walked among us for so long that he's forgotten that he isn't human. Or perhaps we try to bring a little bit of ourselves into the narrative to exercise our insecurities and our darker facets. I think he also represents aspects of the human experience that we are told to avoid. He's a voice imploring us to stay on the straight and narrow, avoid vice and morality, and keep them at a distance. He symbolizes the inherent challenges of our time. He is strength and yet fundamental weakness. And his purpose is driven really by anyone who is telling his story. The more that we turn to these stories and see them as more than just folklore fairy tales, we can gain a new perspective on the past and also gain an insight into the lives of those who are left on the sidelines by traditional narratives, historical narratives. And it's almost as if that by looking at these stories, these marginalized people can reach across the centuries and allow us to see our commonalities with them. By seeing folklore as an accessible gateway into history, I think that a whole new perspective emerges. And these stories have endured for a reason. They've stood firm against the tides of time. And it's because that they mattered. They mattered to the communities that told them, and they matter to us now. Among other things, they do present those fears of a generation. And I really believe that the devil, at least in the Shropshire context, served as a vehicle for the concerns of a community. He gives a name to those things that are unexplainable, as well as a historical meaning for such the narratives. I think they also gain a new purpose when we talk about them now in the 21st century. We can ensure that they endure. We can ensure that they are continuing to be told, and that also that they gain a new purpose. I think, as I've said, the devil is fluid and that he will serve us however we see fit. So tonight we're going to be looking a little bit about how society is engaged with devil myths, particularly in the Shropshire context, and how also this character, this stock character, has developed its own personality within different distinct spaces. So, for example, the devil of the agrarian landscape is a very different entity to the devil of an industrialised one, which we see both of in Shropshire. This is by no means an exhaustive account of the devil in Shropshire. As I said earlier, he literally spends so much time in the county and the stories are scattered all over the place. But hopefully they will demonstrate the devil's multitudes. So I want to begin with a fairly popular narrative, a narrative that I've spoken about quite a bit, and that is the story about the Boat Inn in Jackfield. Now, the Boat Inn is a lovely pub. You can still visit it to this day. And it serves the community of Jackfield, which is about 2 miles upriver or downriver from Ironbridge. So it's in the Coalbrookdale Valley. And Jackfield now is incredibly picturesque. It's a beautiful little place. But during the advent of industry, it was a very, very different environment. It's described in quite negative terms as having all the trappings of a port town: alehouses, brothels, broken families, you name it, it was there. And it was a very, very working class, industrialized area with its own unique challenges and issues. And it's said that on one evening, just before Christmas, the devil paid a visit to Jackfield. But not only did he pay a visit to the area, he actually went to the Boat Inn. Now, this was just after everyone had stopped working for the Christmas break. So they were enjoying a pint, they were merry and they were happy, and the alcohol was flowing. And all of a sudden, this stranger was said to have walked into the pub, and he made a beeline to the bar and asked for a drink and started flirting with the barmaids. So this already put some of the local men's guard up a little bit, because this man was someone they'd never met before. It was quite a close-knit community, and he's flirting with their barmaids. The thing that was strangest about this man is that he was dressed in absolute finery, far finer than anything they had seen in the area at any time. But also, it was finery that you wouldn't necessarily link to the era. We're talking about 1895, the story starts to be told from. And he was dressed more like a chap from the 1600s or early 1700s. So already they're thinking he's a bit of a weirdo. But the stranger starts to make his way around the bar, flirting with women, the bar ladies, and whispering promises into the men's ear, asking them if they would happen to play a game of cards with them, and telling them that they'll get whatever they want if they play this game of cards and win. Now, as the ale began to flow and people started to get a little bit more drunk, they started to take this stranger up on his offer, and they began to play card games. But unfortunately, everyone who played lost. Now, this only enraged people, and they started to get quite angry at this stranger who had wandered into their pub one Christmas and caused them to lose money and humiliate themselves. But he opened a big bag full of gold and whispered more promises and told them that they could get whatever they wanted if they played that game of cards. So they continued to play, and as you can imagine, he made his way around the pub, causing a bit of a scene, and everyone was losing. But in the corner of the pub, there was a chap who was a blacksmith, and he wasn't one for merriment. He just wanted a quiet pint. But he realised the only way he would be able to get his quiet pint on that Christmas evening would be as if he played cards with the stranger. He was pretty good at cards, and he knew what he was doing, and he knew that if he could play this chap, he could get rid of him, he could go, and then he could enjoy his quiet evening. So he called him over, and the man asked him what he would want, what would be his wish if he won. And all he said was that my wish is that you'd bugger off and I could have a quiet pint, mate. So they played cards, and it was quite a close match when all of a sudden the blacksmith drops his cards on the floor. The stranger very quickly bends down to try and pick them up, but the blacksmith gets there sooner, and the blacksmith is greeted by 2 massive hooves and hairy legs. And all of a sudden, the devil whips up a storm, and he is pulled out with a massive gust of wind out of the pub, laughing and screaming curses on that cold winter night in Jackfield. And this story has been told since around the 1895, and it's been shared in various iterations since. And at first, it seems like quite a comical story, particularly with it being so rooted in a particular place, the Boat Inn in Jackfield. One can imagine a chap telling the story after a few pints and really making a lot of it and putting on voices for the devil. But I think if we look at it in a little bit more detail and peel away some of these layers, we might actually see some of the rich symbolism that is actually linked to this story. So it's important to note that Jackfield, and the surrounding area, the Coalbrookdale, Ironbridge, the Severn Valley, as it's known, was a completely new environment in Shropshire. With the advent of industry, it became a landscape full of flame and fire and smog. It was described, the ironmaking, as the most awe-inspiring of industries. And from about 1760, 1770, we start to get a growth of people visiting the area, bringing their own stories and bringing their own ideas about what they're seeing. Ironmaking was also described as the most alchemical of industries. It was linking it to this magical process of turning one thing into another. And this landscape had once been rural, was changed into flame and blast furnace. And we see a number of descriptions cropping up where it's described with satanic or hell-like imagery. Ironbridge, the area was described as having almost apocalyptic significance. The approach to Coalbrookdale was a veritable descent into the infernal regions, according to one Italian visitor from 1787. And there's frequent descriptions of flame and sooty labourers like demons of the lower world. To those who inhabited this space or visited this space, it became like hell. And as we see in several other areas of Shropshire that have an industrialised history, there is a growth of devil stories with the growth of industry. So I believe that the Industrial Revolution in Shropshire made its own devils that were in the mire and the dirt, just as the people who were working there were. If we also look at some of the influences in the Jackfield and Coalbrookdale area, there was a very, very prominent teetotal movement in that area from around 1880 through to about 1895, which is a contemporary to our story. So could not the devil in the alehouse, Old Scratch's visit to the Boat Inn, not symbolise in some parts and in some ways the teetotalist idea that the demon of drink and that the no good could come from the alehouse? And I can't help but think of how different groups of people would have interacted with that story. You would have the men potentially in the pub laughing and telling it, but I can't help but think of their wives at home wondering if their husbands would bring any money left when they came back from the alehouse. So I think it's a perfect example of how these stories can have multiple layers and could give us a little insight into the world in which they inhabit. And many of our stories tonight will actually link in some way either to a place or a group of people. I want to move on now to two stories which feel slightly older than some of the other ones we're going to be sharing. And they are linked to pre-existing structures or pre-existing holy wells that are occurring in Shropshire. So the first one is about the Devil's Causeway. Now, the Devil's Causeway runs really quite a short area between Cardington and Ruckley in Shropshire. Sometimes it's linked as it's suggested as being between Acton Burnell and Cardington, but it's all the same road. And it's said that the Devil's Causeway was built by the devil in a single night. And he was incredibly proud of this road. And he didn't really want to leave it because he was so proud of this environment and this road that he actually would patrol it night upon night and make sure that it was safe. Now, legends and stories started to emerge about this road that if you are upon it of a night time in the darkness, you will bump into the devil. The devil, rather bizarrely in this instance, is described as resembling a cow, but also having some man-like features. So he's like a man cow. But he has a specific set of requirements. If you are a good person, he will rough you up a little bit, but he will let you pass and go away unhindered. However, if you are bad, or you are wicked, or you have sinned in your life, he will beat you to a bloody pulp and leave you on the side of the road for dead. And I think this is really interesting because the Devil's Causeway itself is actually a small stretch of Roman road which is left over from the Romans. But it links very much to the idea of how unsafe stepping out of your house over the threshold and going on a journey was in the early modern period and even beyond. We know for a fact that during the late medieval going into the early modern, all of this area, and including several other areas in Shropshire, really had a bandit problem. There's one area on Wenlock Edge that had such a bad bandit problem that people just did not go that way, and that's how you get the development of Ipperkin, the robber bandit ghost. So really we're seeing a snippet of the past and a past issue being shared through this story and being attributed to the devil. The devil is becoming a feature of a landscape that was dangerous or harmful. And also, it's really interesting to think about how people in the past have understood a particular landscape that was there before them. This is a Roman road. This is a fragment of a road that would look very different, and it has been attributed to the devil. And just down the road, literally from the Devil's Causeway, is an old, arguably Roman, but there is some evidence that it's slightly earlier, holy well, known, now defunct, but known as Frog Well. And it's known as Frog Well because the devil and his favourite imps are said to gather there when they want a bit of downtime and take the form of frogs. Now, the devil is said to be the biggest frog, the scariest looking frog, and he is said to sit at the depths of the water and not really cause any issues. However, some of his imps are said to be seen quite frequently swimming or around the edge. And local communities local to Frogwell would warn young people and children to avoid Frogwell lest the devil take their soul. Now, this is interesting partly because it's got the devil as a frog in it, but also because it demonstrates, again, the idea of an inherently dangerous landscape being linked to the devil. In the early modern period going into the industrial period, many people in landlocked counties like Shropshire would not be able to swim. So even a small body of water could potentially hold dangerous, particularly for young children. So here we see the devil representing the concerns of the community. We do not want our children to drown. We do not want our husbands to be beaten to death on the road as they're on their travels, so that we use the devil to warn them. And that is one section of really how the devil is used in Shropshire folklore. He is used as something to warn people or to get people to avoid a particular landscape. But now I want to look in a little bit more detail about the devil's interactions with people, which are possibly what I find the most interesting parts of Shropshire folklore. So we're going to journey up to North Shropshire and to Wem now and go to 1795. So again, we've got that advent of industry, that later early modern going into the kind of not quite but Victorian era. And one evening in Wem, some very, very dandy young chaps were said to go to the pub, the local pub in Wem. Unfortunately, it's never actually listed on which one. And they were said to get very rowdy and very drunk and then decide to summon the devil. They did this for some reason. They had the correct amount of salt, the correct amount of candles, and they all knew the incantations needed to summon the devil. So after having a bit of a skinful, they create the circle of salt, do the right incantations, and the devil appears. The devil is wrathful, so angry that he has been interrupted and brought to this alehouse in the back end of Beyond in Wem. And it's interesting because even though he is wrathful, he's contained. The devil cannot leave that pub. He is contained within that circle of salt, but just showing how angry he is. So the lads scarper in fear, and they leave the poor landlord to deal with the devil in his pub. And he tries several different things. He tries different incantations, but it doesn't seem to work. They try different vicars, local vicars, but no one is pious enough to reduce the devil back to his domain. It's not until they go to Battlefield, which is an area just outside of Shrewsbury. It's actually the site of the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403. And they contact a Reverend Hotchkiss. The Reverend Hotchkiss later becomes the headmaster of the Shrewsbury School. So he's had a busy old life, Reverend Hotchkiss. But he is known across Shropshire for his piety. And it's interesting to see how kind of folklore and history are entwining a little bit here. We have a clearly very folkloric situation. Some drunk young men have summoned the devil, but an actual person that we have records for being involved in this story. So Reverend Hotchkiss goes to Wem and he prays incessantly for 3 days and 3 nights, and the devil is eventually brought back down to hell. And this story, again, could be seen and could be viewed as a form of entertainment. You've got the alehouse motif, feckless, drunk young men summoning something far more than they can control. But also, if we dig a little bit deeper and look at that link between piety and merriment, you could see it almost as a moralizing tale about how Christian power and Christian piety can overcome and straighten out the fecklessness of youth. And I want to stay now with some clergymen. 2 more of our tales are going to be linked to the clergy, which in itself is an interesting comment on their role within Shropshire life. And I want us to go to a building known as Place Hall. Now, Place Hall is really bloody haunted. It's got about 5 or 6 different ghosts, but also it was said to play host to the devil. One Sunday evening, a group of local clergymen went to Place Hall, brought their best brandy and their best alcohol, and they all got very, very, very drunk and started playing cards on the Sabbath and other games. The cards, as probably you all know, are a very, very frequent motif in Shropshire folklore regarding the devil and wider worldwide folklore. But inadvertently, their lack of piety on the Sabbath summons the devil. All of the candles blow out and there's a loud, guttural kind of roar, and then before them is stood his infernal prince, the devil himself. All these cowardly vicars and clergymen run away as fast as they can, except for one. He is petrified and he's stood still in front of the devil himself. And the local clergymen scatter. They don't go back to the house. They don't for 2 days because they're so terrified by what they saw, and their lack of morality kind of makes them feel guilty. But after 2 days, they realise that they haven't seen their friend. They haven't seen the man that they left at the hall. So they creep back to the building, and there they find a massive blood stain full of blood and viscera of their former friend. He has been reduced to a smear on the carpet. And this, we see the devil acting as a moralizer. And in several of Shropshire's stories, the devil is not acting in a way that you would necessarily expect in the Judeo-Christian idea. The devil is the one that is enacting the justice and moralizing if you do something wrong, if you defy the Sabbath, you will be punished by the devil. But also, I think in a lot of these stories that do concern the clergy, this one and particularly the next one, the devil is being used as a vehicle to criticize the established power classes and also as a marker for evil. The devil is enacting out punishment on the higher levels of society. But in several of our other tales, he is very easily outwitted by the agrarian classes and the working classes. So here we see really the power of the oral tradition and who these stories would have likely have belonged to before Victorian folklorists like Charlotte Byrne wrote them down. The devil is able to exercise this extreme force towards the clergymen who are doing wrong because they are doing wrong. And I think often the devil is used to maybe suggest that those in power are not necessarily deserving of that power. And we do see several instances where the devil is righting the wrongs of the clergy, or he's righting the wrongs of landowners or lords or those kind of people. So I want to just turn now to another clergy story. And it's a fairly recent one in terms of the devil folklore. It was written down around 1915, and it was shared with a writer by a group of unscrupulous women known only as the women from Whitchurch and Prees Heath. So one can imagine that they had a lot to say. I can imagine them now. And it concerns a community called Itefield, which again is in North Shropshire. And Itefield was said to have a vicar that was in league with the devil. The vicar was known as Old Rook, and he had a black shadow over him and was a particularly negative force in the community. But the community was so afraid of his knowledge or what he was capable of that they actually kind of just allowed him to stay in power, and they avoided having any direct link to him, really. And the vicar, he lived in a vicarage and with a great, great garden. So he employed a number of staff from the village of Itefield, including a young boy about 8 to 10 years old. In some versions of the story, he's slightly older, in some he's slightly younger. And this young boy was harmless, but he was incredibly cheeky. He was incredibly kind of always answering back and having something to say, a bit like some of my year eights. But he was harmless and he didn't really have anything negative. He just was a bit cheeky. But the young boy really got on Old Rook's nerves. And one day, rather, in a fit of rage, Old Rook said that he needed to leave and he didn't have a job anymore and he needed to go somewhere else and he never wanted to see him. So this poor boy had lost his job, but he really needed the money. He was from a very working class family and he needed that money to help provide for his other brothers and sisters. So he wandered the village looking for another form of employment. And sadly, he couldn't find anywhere. He described, according to the folktale, that wherever he went, he felt like there was a shadow over him and no one was willing to give him a chance. So terrified was he of going home and admitting to his parents that he'd lost his job, that he continued to wander the surrounding area looking for anyone to give him a chance. But it was on that journey home, that slow, dejected journey home, that he bumped into the vicar again. He bumped into Old Rook. And Old Rook rather glibly asked him what he was doing. And the young boy said, "I'm looking for work." To which Old Rook replied, "You'll never be in need of that again," and then went on his way. Not long after Old Rook had passed him, the boy fell to his knees and convulsed and fitted in a terrible state of affairs and was dragged into one of the local houses and kept there till his parents could get there. For 3 days and 3 nights, this poor young chap, he sweated and he vomited and he convulsed and he talked of an evil black shadow that stood over his bed that had been there since he had bumped into Old Rook. And on the third day, the young boy succumbed to his illness and he died. Nothing ever became of Old Rook. He was never tried of anything. He was never chased out of the village. He continued to pollute their spiritual landscape long until his death. And I think this story is very powerful for a number of reasons. Not only does it link the devil and stories of the devil and potentially belief in the devil into the 20th century, but also, even if there was never a boy and there was never an Old Rook and this situation never happened, it is allowing a community to criticize a established figure within it. It's giving a voice to the voiceless and saying that this vicar should have been a father figure to his community, and instead he has enacted harm upon a child. So sometimes those who are in power are not deserving of that power and they are not worthy of trust. And I think the devil then is allowing them to make quite an established criticism and to criticize the power system of a rural community, which otherwise they'd have been voiceless. So I want to just briefly now go to Shrewsbury, because if there is one place in Shropshire that the devil hates more than anywhere, it's Shrewsbury. So the original form of the Wrekin Giant story, where the giant is going off to Shrewsbury to dam the river to flood it, was actually the devil. And it was only when Charlotte Byrne preferred the idea of it being a giant that she wrote down that version and popularized that version. But a lot of earlier versions of the Wrekin Giant tale actually contain a very, very vengeful old scratch who is trying to destroy Shrewsbury. And he's had a number of attempts on Shrewsbury's existence over the years. And one was written in the chapbook of St Altman's Church in 1553. So in 1553, there was said to be a massive storm, unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. It was biblical. Rain thundered through the sky and thunder lashed and lightning cracked around the whole atmosphere, and it terrified the locals. And cloaked by that storm, the devil was said to launch an attack on St Altman's Church, which has a very, very tall spire. It's still there to this day. He climbed his way up the spire. He lashed at the bell and damaged the clock, and was said to have left a hoof print on the bell, which supposedly can still be seen to this day. He effectively, on that night, conquered St Altman's Church, and now he uses it as a watchpost away from the Stiperstones. So when he's not on the Stiperstones, he's looking out over the whole of Shrewsbury and the surrounding area from the spire of St Altman's Church. And it's said that he only really leaves it if he sees someone encroaching on his space at the Stiperstones. If he sees anyone sitting on his chair, he will fly his way back and enact vengeance in the form of rain or storm or harsh conditions. But he effectively conquered that part of Shrewsbury that evening. And it's interesting because there's an area of Shrewsbury known as Mardle, and Mardle comes from Mard Wall, a boundary wall. And it was believed that Mardle was actually at one point the boundary of the devil's power in Shrewsbury. And that links very nicely with the area in which St Altman's Church is. But I want to just mention briefly another time that the devil was supposedly in Shrewsbury. And that was the time that Old Scratch went to the theatre. So the first written evidence we have of this story comes from around 1703. However, Charlotte Byrne expands on Reverend Elias Owens' story, and she includes it in her Sheaf of Gleanings, Shropshire Folklore book. And it is said that in 1703, the devil appeared in his own proper person to play his own part during the opening night of Dr. Faustus in Shrewsbury. He was so insulted by the way in which the actors played him that he appeared at Shrewsbury in his finest garb to show them how he could do better. And we see this, it's not a unique story to Shropshire. There are evidence of this kind of idea of the devil coming to see Dr. Faustus from 1604, 1633 in various different areas like Germany and some again in parts of England. But his appearance at Dr. Faustus and his embodiment of the role was said to have drove theatre goers from the theatres to their prayers, from pleasures to prayers, because of how terrific and terrifying this image was. And I think in a way, though we have moved away from Puritan piety of the middle of the 1600s, in some ways it's a reminiscence of that idea that there is something inherently sinful about theatre, and that a good Christian would never ever partake in that kind of activity. So many of Shropshire's areas and locations do have satanic associations. I think often the focus is on the Stiper Stones. I'm guilty of that myself, because it's one of the most established areas in satanic lore of Shropshire. It has been known and linked to the devil since around 1595, but even before that, it probably would have had that link. It just wasn't written down until then. But I think the stories that we've discussed tonight show how expertly the devil was being used as a tool within storytelling. He is being used as a vehicle for a community to exercise their fears, their concerns, and even their criticisms. Also, I think he's often used in several stories as a marker for evil when compared to humanity. So we have several instances in Shropshire of the devil being so amazed by a person's aptitude for evil that he doesn't allow them in hell. And one particular example of that is Wicked Will the Blacksmith, which is the will-o'-wisp origin story. And Wicked Will was said to be so good at doing everything bad and embodying everything that was a sin and the evils of the flesh, that when his time come to die, he was told that he was going to hell. And he begged to St. Peter, he told that he was sorry for his actions and that he never ever would have done that again. And if he had his time again, he would be good and a law-abiding Christian. Peter felt pity on him, so he said to him, all right, I will give you another chance. You will have your life from the start again, and you will live your life as a good Christian. When you wake up in the morning, you will be an innocent baby, innocent with all of the love of Jesus Christ, and you will have your chance to be a better person. So Wicked Will woke up the next morning as a baby, and he quickly made a start of being even worse than he was the first time round. And throughout this narrative, we see Will being described as even more evil than he was in his first intonation. So when it came to going to heaven, he was very, very quickly denied access. The doors were shut and he was sent down to hell. The devil took one look at him and he said, there is no way you are coming into my abode. You will overthrow me. You're even worse than me. So he wasn't allowed into hell. And after some backing and throwing between heaven and hell, the devil took pity on him and gave him a lump of coal to keep him warm and set him off wandering across the different planes. And that's how we supposedly got the will-o'-wisp phenomena. But in this story, the devil is only used as a marker for the evil of humanity. And I think the reason why we have these multitudes of the devil, and there is far more than I could discuss in one sitting tonight, is because he has changed over our 300 years, because we've changed. He is also linked to certain areas like Offa's Dyke, which was created by him having a plough team with a turkey and a goose, ploughing a furrow. He's linked to village boundaries, such as stiles. And in certain parts of Shropshire, when you come to a stile, you must turn an item of your clothing inside out. Charlotte Byrne, in a very condemning manner, reports that some local village women would actually take their whole dress off and turn it inside out, exposing their bare breasts to avoid the devil. He also is capable of sneaking down chimneys and stealing apples from orchards. He embodies whatever fear a community has. And I think that he's a very powerful, powerful metaphor for humanity, particularly for those marginalized communities that don't have a way of exercising their ideas themselves. We have looked at but a small section tonight of tales of the devil in a relatively small area in England. But I believe these stories in both Shropshire and of a wider area are wholly important because they serve as a palimpsest. They were a marker of belief and they show the impact of the oral tradition. And I think in a lot of ways, they're just as important as traditional ghost stories because the devil fills in the gaps. The devil is there to represent the negative experiences of the community. And I think my closing statement would be, if you are interested in any aspect of the satanic folklore of either Shropshire or the wider parts of Britain, to dig deeply and look at these stories, but also consider what they could potentially symbolise. Consider what they mean to you, as well as what they mean to the communities they belong to. So that's everything. Thank you.
And then I realised that I'm still muted. Thank you very much, Amy. Sorry about that.
You.
And me talking away there and wondering, I wonder why no one's... Oh, I see, yeah. Well, excellent talk, excellent. So, the devil in Shropshire. At the end of the day, it's interesting that you associate him so much with industrialisation. Were there any medieval devil stories? Is there any older devil folklore associated that you can think of? Because
I've never come across a story in Shropshire, and I'm currently researching these stories quite heavily because I'm writing my first book about the devil in Shropshire. It's my first book, not my first book about that, but I probably could write several. And I've never come across a story that has any evidence of being medieval in origin. I can't speak for other areas, but in Shropshire, the earliest I've kind of seen an example for is around the kind of 1600s, middle of the 1600s. Certainly, I would imagine things like Frogwell are, you could argue, perhaps linked to an older tradition of kind of water spirits or water veneration, or the rejection of water veneration at a later date. But I would say that the devil in Shropshire is a very new phenomenon, new for a medieval historian like myself. So he's around 350 to 400 years old, but he really comes into his own in some parts of Shropshire during the Industrial Revolution, but also in other parts of almost as a counter to the Industrial Revolution. So we get a number of stories of quite agrarian kind of devil folklore, where the devil is not able to outwit the farmer's son or the labourer or the local farmer because he doesn't have the he doesn't have the farming knowledge. So there's a really extended narrative about a little tiny hamlet in Shropshire called Skybury. And the basic premise is that the devil is outwitted very easily because he doesn't understand the environment, whereas the lad from Skybury understands the rural environment. He is a continuation of that rural legacy, that agrarian knowledge. So he's able to outwit the devil. So you do get some instances of that.
I was just trying to remember, there is a Shropshire character, isn't there? A kind of famous, like Jack O'Kent. He's one of the Jack O'Kent suggested origins, who was an Elizabethan doctor. I've tried to forgotten his name, who's often associated with devil legends, but they might be more in Herefordshire than Shropshire. I'm going to look him up later on.
Yeah, there's a link to the Skybury one. It's David Ap Evan, who it's a very similar Jack O'Kent idea of the topsail tales. The devil picks the wrong one for the potatoes and for the corn and for that, this, that, and the other, because he doesn't understand the landscape. So it is very similar to Jack O'Kent.
That was the story I was thinking of. Yeah, it's David Ap Evans. Yeah, where was he based? Was he
Skybury? So Skybury is at the absolute reaches of Shropshire. It's near Clun. Clun is probably the nearest big place, and Clun is not very big at all. So it's
And the fishing castle, the mighty cities, I'll have you know.
So
It's amazing.
Skybury, and Skybury is two very isolated little communities called Nether Skybury and Lower Skybury, and he's meant to have lived there.
Right. I commented in the Uncanny community that last year at we played Ippican's Edge, an adventure by my friend Anna, who's from Shropshire. We play a Ars Magica 13th century folklore role-playing game based in Shropshire. Hence my vague knowledge of Shropshire folklore.
That's really cool.
But the medieval stuff, if there was any, I would expect to find it. The monasteries often had volumes called Mirabilia, which is where they recorded sort of folk legends, miracles, stories, magical happenings, and things like that. Mirabilia were common to quite a lot of places because they would be stories that would be read out to the tourist trade, to the pilgrimage trade, but same thing. But I don't know how many of them survive, but that would be where you would find the medieval stuff. Now, I'm wondering, I think you're completely right. I think the devil comes in very much in the Industrial Revolution, but I'm wondering if that's also because that's the first time we actually get to hear working class voices.
Yeah, I think it is linked to that. And you do see, I'll preface this with I love Charlotte Byrne and I'm so grateful for what she did for Shropshire. But you see how she very clearly picked and chose what she deemed was acceptable. So particularly, I'm from Telford, the Telford area, which was the, East Shropshire coalfield. And she does the East Shropshire coalfield particularly dirty. She's always talking about how stupid and suspicious we are and how we do things and believe things that are so disgusting and inferior that we should not speak of them. And I would love to know what some old jockey from what's now Telford told her that shocked her so much she didn't write it down. So I do think we do get working class voices, but I think they're very heavily doctored by people like Charlotte Byrne, who was clutching her pearls a little bit about probably what one of my ancestors told her.
Got the impression that Telford has always had a bad rep, considering since the 60s, at least, since the modern development, Telford is just seen as like an extension of Birmingham or the Black Country or whatever, and it gets this really bad rep, which it doesn't deserve because it's lovely. I mean, Telford's a great place, and if it wasn't for Telford, I think a lot of the communities in Shropshire would be in the state of Herefordshire, which is not to say there's anything wrong with Herefordshire, but it's a bit like, going to outer Mongolia. If you heard about one day about the, Hereford death worm, no one would be surprised, would they?
No. I'm proud to be from Telford. I am. It took me a long time. I'm 30 next week, and it took me till this age to say, actually, I'm proud to be from Telford. But we have a very interesting and diverse history, and a lot of the communities that make up Telford are doomsday communities. So Dawley is well, it's not the most exotic place in the world, but Dawley was a doomsday settlement, and Madeley was a pre-doomsday settlement. And I think there's a lot of history that people overlook because Telford is seen as an extension of the West Midlands.
I think that's the problem with all new towns. I mean, Milton Keynes consists of a number of 5 historic villages which had their own traditions, their own history, their own folklore. But nowadays you say Milton Keynes and it's a joke. Yeah. Because it's an agglomeration of previously existing, or it was expanded greatly, got that reputation. Telford, though, is quite a nice place to live, isn't it?
Yes, I'm moving back in September, so hopefully it'll still be nice. I've got a job teaching RE in the school opposite where I grew up, which is a bit bizarre. So hopefully it'll be as nice as when I grew up there.
Last question from me before I hand over to Christian, who'll go through the questions.